Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The air in Lagos that morning was unusually still, as though the humid skies were holding their breath in anticipation of the chaos that was about to unravel. Adesua Balogun stood outside her expansive mansion in Ikoyi, wearing a simple black gown that clung to her slender frame. Black was the color of mourning, and she was fresh from the funeral of her late husband, Chief Tunde Balogun, a revered businessman and philanthropist whose name was well known from the bustling streets of Lagos Island to the corridors of power in Abuja. The funeral had been grand, as expected of a man of Chief Tunde's stature. Political heavyweights, distant relatives, and local chiefs had come in droves, dressed in Aso-Ebi outfits, paying respects with tributes and tears that left Adesua feeling a vortex of grief, pride, and uncertainty. Chief Tunde had been a powerful force in the country's shipping and real estate industries, owning a network of businesses that provided for hundreds of families. Though he was well respected, rumors had always swirled about his extravagant lifestyle. Whispers of an extramarital affair would surface at extended family gatherings, but Adesua, ever the loyal wife, had tried to preserve her dignity by not giving life to the rumors. Even when she suspected that her husband's late nights were spent in questionable company, she never confronted him head-on. Love and fear of public scandal had kept her silent. Now that he was gone, Adesua felt the weight of his absence like a physical anchor pulling her into uncharted depths. She was left with her 16-year-old daughter, Tommy, who stood near the tall iron gates, eyes downcast, arms folded protectively over her chest. They had each other, but their future felt alarmingly uncertain despite the empire her husband had left behind. In any ordinary circumstance, a widow of a multimillionaire would, at the very least, find some solace in the knowledge of inheritance, but life rarely goes according to neat expectations. Inside the living room, large portrait photographs of Chief Tunde were propped against the wall, reminders of his triumphant pursuits. Photographs of him shaking hands with foreign investors, commissioning new schools in rural towns, and standing proudly with dignitaries at ceremonial occasions told the story of a man who had come from humble beginnings in Ibadan to become a nationwide phenomenon. His name was synonymous with success. Yet all these photographic memories only intensified Adesua's heartbreak. She would have given anything to see him walk through the front door one more time. The funeral had concluded just the day before. People were still calling, sending text messages filled with condolences, and bringing covered plates of jollof rice, fried plantains, and stewed fish. In Yoruba tradition, neighbors and friends believed that a mourning widow should not bother about cooking for herself during the initial days of grieving. Although the show of support was comforting, Adesua still felt an unshakable chill coursing through her. Something about the funeral's final proceedings had set her on edge, though she couldn't exactly place it. There was a sense that someone was watching her from afar, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. That someone soon revealed herself to be Saad, her husband's ex-mistress. Though not everyone in the family circle had met Saad personally, rumors floated around that she was a stylish woman, perhaps in her early 30s, who had once been a nightclub singer before crossing paths with Chief Tunde. Their supposed affair had generated hushed gossip. Adesua never confronted Tunde about it, telling herself it was idle talk, yet deep down, a part of her sensed that the tales might hold a kernel of truth. Saad had been present at the funeral but kept her distance from the main tent. Adesua spotted her standing at the far end of the cemetery, wearing a pair of oversized sunglasses that hardly disguised the animosity in her posture. In a place of communal grief, Saada's presence felt more like a silent threat. She had a young son by her side, Bayo, rumored to be the product of the affair with Tunde. The night after the burial, as Adesua tried to calm Tommy into getting some sleep, her phone buzzed. The text message read, "We need to talk about the will. Saad." That brief message was the start of a nightmare Adesua had not foreseen. She stared at the screen, her throat tightening. Why was Saad texting about a will? Chief Tunde's lawyers had not yet called Adesua to any official reading. She had assumed the typical procedures would start in a week or two, once the extended mourning period was observed. Confusion swirled in her mind. Did Saad have some piece of information about Tun's assets that Adesua didn't know? Tommy peered at her mother curiously, but Adesua simply tucked her phone away. That evening, she drifted to sleep on the living room couch, lulled not by peace but by dread. The next day, Adesua tried to push aside the disquiet in her heart. She went about greeting mourners who stopped by the house, handing them drinks and small plates of food as was custom. However, the uneasy feeling spiked when an envelope was delivered by a bike courier wearing a bright orange vest. He handed the envelope to a house staff member, who in turn gave it to Adesua. She noticed the letter's header, Barrister Abel and Associates. That was a law firm she had never heard of before. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. It was an official notice from Sada's lawyers, stating that a recently discovered wilts declared Sada's son as the primary heir to Chief Tun's estate. Adesua's hands shook as she read words that felt too surreal to be true: property, assets, and inheritance. The entire family empire allegedly left to a child she barely knew existed. Shock reverberated through her as she sank onto a chair. Could Tund have done this? Even if he had fathered a son outside of wedlock, wouldn't he have informed her? Why leave everything to Bayo and nothing to Tommy, his legitimate daughter? The scenario made little sense. Yet the official language of the letter was menacingly clear. Adesua had a limited window to vacate the premises, or they would take steps to reclaim the property through legal or other means. Outside, the hum of Lagos traffic seemed to grow louder. Within seconds, Adesua felt as though she was drowning in the noise, the horns blaring, Okada riders shouting, the screech of tires, and vendors hawking goods. The chaos inside her mind was louder than any street clamor. Reality was unraveling. The unimaginable was happening, and she had no choice but to confront it head-on. Her heart pounded with a mix of betrayal, confusion, and anger. Saad wasn't just an afterthought. She was a threat who had come armed with legal documents, well-timed to exploit Adesua's raw grief. As if that wasn't enough, the letter mentioned that Saad and her legal counsel would be meeting with Adesua in 48 hours to discuss how best to cooperate and facilitate the transition of properties. That was the moment the million questions swirling in Adesua's mind began to coalesce into a singular focus. Why is this happening, and how do I stop it? With tears in her eyes, she clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the emptiness of the great living room, once full of Tun's laughter. She had survived many storms in her life: the struggles of building a marriage with a powerful man, the scrutiny of the media, and the demands of being a mother. But never had she felt so powerless. She couldn't let Tommy see her crumble. Somehow, she would have to find the strength to fight. One thing was certain: the days of quiet mourning were over. A new battle was brewing, and she would need more than her tears to emerge from it unscathed. 2 days later, Adesua found herself in the plush, glass-walled offices of Barrister Abel and Associates. She arrived in a modest car driven by her older cousin, Remy, who had insisted on accompanying her. Remy was an energetic woman in her late 40s, known for her no-nonsense attitude. Ever since hearing about the letter, Remy had been fuming with righteous anger on Adesua's behalf. She refused to let her cousin walk into the lion's den alone. The law firm's reception was adorned with marble floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights, reflecting the image of Adesua's black kitten heels. The place exuded intimidation, likely meant to make visitors feel small and in need of the firm's prestigious representation. Nervousness fluttered in Adesua's stomach, but she tried to steady herself by recalling the resilience she had gained over the years. The city of Lagos was a terrain of hustlers and survivors. She would have to dig deep to find her own survival strategy. "Mrs. Baligan, welcome," said a young receptionist, sizing up Adesua's attire. Despite the striking gold wedding band on Adesua's finger, the cold stare made her feel like an intruder. "Barrister Abel is expecting you. Please go straight ahead, the second door to your left." Remy placed a protective hand on Adesua's shoulder as they walked down a short corridor. The glass windows allowed them a view of the cityscape: tall buildings, endless cars, and people hurrying along the sidewalks. It felt strange to be in this bubble of sterile legal decor while her entire life was under siege. Inside the meeting room, they were greeted by Barrister Abel himself, a tall, wiry man with a shaved head. He wore a crisp navy suit and kept glancing at his watch as though he had better things to do than speak with a grieving widow. Across the polished mahogany table sat Saad, looking painfully triumphant in a fitted red dress, her hair in neat braids, eyes hidden behind tinted designer frames. Beside her sat a younger lawyer who looked as though he was fresh from law school, scribbling notes in a leather-bound folder. Adesua took a moment to observe Sada's composure. She remembered the anxious figure at the funeral, standing by the gravestone with Bayo in tow. Now Sada's posture radiated new confidence. For a brief moment, their eyes met, Adesua's reflecting sorrow, while Sada's shone with a steely determination. The tension in the room was thick, enough to choke any semblance of polite conversation. Barrister Abel broke the silence. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Balogun. We understand that this is a difficult time for you and your family." Remy, who never missed a beat, fired back. "It certainly is, especially when an unexpected will is produced by a complete stranger to the family." Her tone was laced with sarcasm and fury. Adesua gently touched Remy's arm, hoping to keep matters civil enough to glean useful information. Clearing his throat, the barrister pressed a button on a digital recorder. "We want to make sure everything is on record. Now, regarding the last will and testament of Chief Tund Balogun." Adesua raised a shaky hand. "I have the right to see this document. I deserve to know its contents firsthand." From her sleek handbag, Saad produced a folder and slid it across the table. "It's all there. Signed, sealed, and dated 3 months before Tund's passing," she said in a measured tone. Adesua's heart thumped as she flipped open the folder. She scanned the first few lines, recognizing Tund's full name and address. Her gaze traveled over paragraphs that stated, in disturbingly explicit terms, that all of Tund's properties, ranging from the Lagos mansion to the expansive farmland in Ogun State, would pass directly to his son and rightful heir, Bayo Balogun, upon Tund's demise. The document also indicated a trust fund to be managed by the boy's mother, Saad, until he reached the age of 21. For a moment, the words on the page seemed to blur. She whispered, "He never mentioned anything about altering his will. He always promised Tommy would be well taken care of." Sada's expression shifted from smug to something approaching pity, though it might have been feigned. "I'm sorry for your shock. But you know Tund was a complicated man. He had his reasons, and he confided in me that he wanted Bayo to have a secure future. Perhaps he felt guilty for not being as present as he should have been." Remy hissed under her breath, "Guilty or not, this is nonsense. You can't just disinherit his lawful wife and daughter without any proper explanation." Barrister Abel remained stoic. "We can assure you this will is legitimate. It was witnessed by 2 reputable individuals, both of whom have signed affidavits attesting to its authenticity." He tapped a finger on a couple of attached pages. Adesua's mind spun. Why had Tund changed his will? Was it blackmail? Had something forced him into this arrangement? Or was there a chance that Tund had genuinely desired to secure Bayo's future at the expense of his wife and daughter? None of it added up. The Tund she knew was a generous father who doted on Tommy, especially in recent years when the rumors of the affair had quieted down. "I need time," Adesua managed to say, suppressing tears that threatened to fall. "I need time to figure out my next steps." Barrister Abel exhaled slowly, folding his arms. "Time is of the essence. The law gives the executor of the will, and that's Ms. Saad Shadapo in this case, the authority to start executing the directives unless you have legitimate grounds for contestation." "And if we want to contest?" Remy asked, eyes narrowed. "You will need to file an application in the federal high court. I must warn you, that could be both time-consuming and extremely costly. And without tangible evidence that this will is fraudulent, your chances are slim." "Thank you for your concern," Remy shot back, her sarcasm undiminished. "We'll see ourselves out." She stood, and Adesua followed, noticing the wave of satisfaction that washed over Sada's face. The ride back to Ikoyi was a blur of honking horns, sweaty street hawkers tapping at the car windows, and the mental storm raging in Adesua's mind. The house she considered her sanctuary now felt like a temporary lodging overshadowed by threats. She had no idea if Tund had truly penned that will, but until she had more information, she was in a precarious position. That evening, Tommy could sense the despair in her mother's eyes. Adesua tried to reassure her daughter with words that even she didn't entirely believe. They dined on a simple meal of boiled yam and stew, but Adesua's appetite had vanished. She found herself poking at her food and replaying the day's meeting in her head, searching for any clue that might prove the will was a sham. After putting Tommy to bed, Adesua locked herself in the study that once belonged to Tund. The smell of his old cologne lingered faintly in the air. She opened drawers, shuffled through papers, and found nothing but routine business documents, leases, partnerships, share certificates, nothing about a new will. Her eyes skimmed over the old will she found in a hidden compartment, dated 5 years prior, which clearly bequeathed equal shares to Tommy and Adesua. That was the Tund she remembered, one who would never abandon his family. But how could she prove this new version was forged? Unable to sleep, Adesua knew she needed legal counsel of her own. But Tund's old law firm might be compromised. They had not contacted her yet, which was suspicious. The big question was, with what money would she hire a new attorney? The household finances were mostly under Tund's name, and if Saad was already stepping in, the bank accounts might be frozen pending final estate settlement. She was on the verge of panic, but she remembered the advice her late grandmother once gave. In the midst of a storm, do not flail your arms. Swim with wisdom and keep your head above water. She had to think strategically. She needed allies and funds, and she needed them soon. Saad had come into the open, and she wasn't playing by any moral code, only a twisted version of legal might. Adesua's tears flowed freely for the first time since the funeral. She cried out of betrayal, fear, and anger at Tund's memory, uncertain whether to accuse him or defend him in her own heart. She cried for Tommy, robbed of a secure future by someone she barely knew. By the time the rooster crowed at sunrise, a sound that still managed to reach Ikoyi from distant corners of the city, Adesua knew she had to stand and fight. She might not have Tund's wealth or status at her disposal anymore, but she had her wits, her faith, and the unwavering love of a mother who would not let her daughter be stripped of her birthright. The battle lines had been drawn, and she vowed to keep pushing forward until she uncovered the truth. For the next several weeks, life became an elaborate dance of survival for Adesua and Tommy. With each passing day, the threats from Sada's camp loomed larger. First came a letter stating that Adesua needed to vacate the mansion within a fortnight. Then a security guard appeared at the gate bearing a new directive. Sada's private investigators would be inventorying the property to catalog all valuables. For Adesua, this intrusion felt like an assault on her dignity. She had spent nearly 2 decades building a life with Tund in that mansion, yet these strangers talked as though she were a tenant whose lease had expired. The reality, however, was that Adesua had limited resources to counter these maneuvers. Her personal bank account had some money from a small catering business she once operated, but it was far from sufficient to engage in a lengthy court battle. Worse, many of Tund's business associates, people who once toasted to her health at lavish parties, were either ducking her calls or offering hollow condolences without tangible help. Some were likely afraid of Sada's legal team. Others suspected the will might indeed be genuine, and they didn't want to get embroiled in the scandal. Desperate for a lifeline, Adesua contacted an old friend, Kemi, who worked as a consultant for an NGO in Victoria Island. They met in a modest cafe tucked away from the main commercial hub, hoping to avoid the prying eyes that often recognized Adesua's face from society pages. Kemi listened intently as Adesua recounted the situation, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is outrageous. I never liked your husband's philandering ways, but I never dreamed he'd leave you in this predicament, even if by accident or manipulation." Adesua sipped her tea, her eyes cast downward. "I don't know what to believe. I'm not even sure Tund is the one who signed that will. But I can't prove anything. And money is tight. I keep scraping together funds for daily expenses. Tommy's school fees are due next term." Kemi took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. "I know a lawyer, someone who's not afraid of big cases. He's not cheap, but he might be willing to work out a payment plan or a percentage arrangement if you have a strong chance of winning. His name is Colonel Ogunro. He's tackled some high-profile inheritance disputes before. The name was unfamiliar to Adesua, but she needed any chance she could get. They arranged a meeting for the following week, and Kemi left promising to do more research. At home, a new routine settled in. Tommy had resumed school, immersing herself in final-year exam preparations, but her anxious eyes told Adesua she was worried about their impending eviction. Adesua tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, going to the market in Balagan with Remy to buy groceries at wholesale prices. They often had hushed conversations in the car about possible strategies to keep the looming crisis at bay. Every day felt like a gauntlet, with Sada's lawyers sending more letters, some borderline threatening. One evening, after a particularly tense day, Adesua heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find a man in a cheap black suit. He introduced himself as Anthony, a clerk from Barrister Abel and Associates, delivering a final notice to vacate. Her hands shook as she held the paper. The ultimatum was harsh. Within 7 days, if she refused to leave the property, Sada's team would request the intervention of law enforcement to remove her belongings. Tommy came downstairs at the commotion and peered at the document over her mother's shoulder. They can't just throw us out. This was Dad's house. And we've always lived here. Her voice cracked, and tears brimmed in her eyes. Adesua swallowed her own tears, hugging her daughter. We'll find a way, my dear. We'll find a way. But the weight of the situation was almost too much to bear. Feeling cornered, Adesua reached out to Colonel Ogunro, the lawyer Kemi had mentioned, and arranged a consultation the next day. When she arrived at Colonel's office in Ikeja, the difference between him and Barrister Abel was striking. Colonel's workspace was smaller, more homely, with walls adorned by African art prints. Instead of intimidation, it exuded warmth. Colonel himself was a stout man with a salt and pepper beard and a calm demeanor that eased some of Adesua's tension. He motioned for her to sit. Mrs. Balagan, I've heard parts of your story from Kemi, but I'd like to hear every detail straight from you. Adesua recounted everything: the funeral, Sada's mysterious emergence, the shock of the will, and the unrelenting harassment. She handed Colonel the old will she discovered in Tun's desk. Colonel studied it, nodded, and then laid it carefully on the desk. This older will is valid unless a newer, legitimate one overrides it. The question is whether Sada's will is indeed authentic. Nervous energy coursed through Adesua's veins as she leaned forward. But how can we prove it's not authentic? The signature, it looks so similar to Tun's. And there are witnesses. Witnesses can be bought, Colonel interjected. Especially if we're dealing with a high-stakes inheritance. Signatures can be forged, documents can be backdated, all sorts of unscrupulous methods exist. The key is to find discrepancies. We can check if Tund was actually in the country on the alleged date of signing. We can investigate the witnesses, examine the notary stamps, and look for anything that breaks the chain of legality. However, all this costs money and time. Adesua bowed her head, her voice trembling. I barely have any money. Most of Tun's accounts have been frozen. My personal savings are nowhere near enough to fund a prolonged legal fight. Colonel leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. We might arrange a contingency fee, where I get paid a certain percentage if we win the case. But we'll still need some funds for initial filings, court processes, and investigators. Have you considered any asset sales or asked for loans from close relatives? She bristled, recalling the lukewarm responses from Tun's old allies and the complicated dynamics in her extended family. Many of them had their own financial struggles or had severed ties when Tund became too powerful. I'll try, she finally said, but I can't guarantee how much I can raise. Colonel nodded. I'd be lying if I said this was going to be easy. Inheritance disputes in Nigeria can be messy, especially when one side has deep pockets. But if you're convinced that will is a forgery, then we have a fighting chance. We have to act quickly, though, before Saad finalizes any property transfers. Their discussion concluded with Colonel agreeing to represent Adesua if she could provide a partial retainer within 2 weeks. Though still plagued by worry, Adesua felt a small flicker of hope spark within her. For the first time since the reading of Sada's will, she had the sense that she wasn't entirely alone. Her next challenge was raising the retainer. She started by calling a few of her old acquaintances, some of whom had once leaned on Tund's benevolence. She played it diplomatically, reminding them of how Tund had helped secure bank loans for their businesses or used his connections to land them lucrative government contracts. A handful of them expressed vague sympathy, but not many were willing to part with cash for what they deemed a risky family feud. One older businessman, Chief Adamma, who had a cordial friendship with Tund, offered Adesua a small loan on the condition that she repay him within a year, with interest. Beggars couldn't be choosers, so she accepted. She also pawned some of her own jewelry, carefully selecting pieces that Tund had given her early in their marriage. The emotional toll was heavy, but the practical needs outweighed sentimental attachments. Over the course of the next week, she managed to gather enough funds to at least start the legal process. She had to break the news to Tommy that they might have to leave the mansion temporarily if the eviction was enforced. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded in reluctant acceptance, determined to support her mother. In a moment of rare camaraderie, Remy offered to let them stay in her 3-bedroom flat in Surulere if the worst came to pass. While it was a big step down in comfort and status, Adesua was grateful. The knowledge that she and her daughter would not be on the street if they lost the house gave her a semblance of stability. But leaving the mansion was a last resort. She wanted to stand firm and show Saad that she would not be intimidated. Yet as the final days of the eviction deadline approached, the tension became almost unbearable. A group of men, presumably hired by Saad, showed up to survey the property, snapping pictures of every room and valuable item. Adesua felt a fierce surge of anger. This was her home, not some piece of real estate to be flaunted. But the men brandished official letters, and she was powerless to physically stop them without risking an incident that could tarnish her reputation in court. Despite the mounting pressure, a kernel of determination remained in Adesua's heart. She had secured a lawyer, gathered some funds, and steeled herself to fight. Everything now hinged on whether they could expose Sada's deception and prove that the supposed will was fraudulent. The storm clouds were gathering, but a single shaft of light began to shine through, the unwavering resolve of a woman who refused to let her life's foundation be stolen by a brazen opportunist. The first few steps of the legal battle were anything but simple. Kunnel had filed an urgent motion for an injunction in the High Court of Lagos, pleading with the court to halt any transfers or forceful evictions until the matter of the will's authenticity was resolved. The judge granted them a date for a preliminary hearing, 4 weeks away. That window of time felt like an eternity to Adesua, but it was her first legal shield against Sada's intimidation tactics. As the days crawled by, Kunnel and his small team of paralegals dug into every detail they could find about Sada's supposed will. They hired a private investigator, a middle-aged ex-police officer named Ikenna, who was known for his dogged curiosity. Ikenna began tracing the origins of the notary stamp, verifying the addresses of the witnesses, and cross-referencing the exact date Tund was said to have signed the document. One afternoon, as Adesua waited anxiously in Kunnel's reception area, she observed the colorful paintings of African marketplaces on the walls. The swirl of vibrant colors reminded her of the hustle and bustle of Balogun Market. She felt the same swirl in her own life, a mix of chaos and perseverance. When Kunnel finally stepped out of his office, he looked worn yet vaguely triumphant. "Mrs. Balogun, can you come in, please?" he said quietly. She followed him inside, and he closed the door behind her. "Ikenna found something," Kunnel began. "We're not entirely sure what it means yet, but it's a lead. Do you recall if Chief Tund traveled during the last week of September last year?" Adesua tilted her head, sifting through her memories. Tund was frequently on business trips, but certain dates stood out. "Yes, if I recall correctly, Tund was in South Africa from around the 23rd to the 30th of September. It was a big conference for African shipping companies in Cape Town. I remember because Tommy had her school's cultural day that week, and Tund sent pictures of himself at the conference." "Why do you ask?" Kunnel nodded, tapping a file on his desk. According to the copy of the will Saad submitted, the document was allegedly signed by Tund in Lagos on the 26th of September. We have an official record from the Cape Town International Conference Center showing that Tund was a registered keynote speaker on that same day. Adesua's pulse quickened. So, that means Tund couldn't have physically signed it in Lagos on the 26th if he was in Cape Town. Kunnal's lips curved into a slight smile. Exactly. If we can verify Tund's presence in South Africa with immigration stamps on his passport or official documents, we'll have a glaring discrepancy in the timeline. That alone won't finalize the case, but it's a major piece of evidence suggesting the will was backdated or forged. Excitement bubbled in Adesua's chest. For the first time since the funeral, she felt a tangible hope that the truth could indeed prevail. So, how do we proceed? Kunnal flipped through a few more pages. We need Tund's passport records, flight tickets, anything that confirms he wasn't in Lagos on the 26th of September. You might also want to see if there are photos of him at the conference on that specific date. Maybe social media posts or official press releases. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case. Over the next 2 weeks, Adesua and Ikeno worked hand in hand, scouring Tund's old travel documents. Fortunately, Tund had always been meticulous about filing away his flight itineraries. In an email archive, they found e-tickets for a flight departing Lagos on September 22nd and returning on October 1st. Adesua also unearthed conference photos from Tund's personal tablet showing him attending a gala dinner in Cape Town on the 26th of September. The timestamp was clear, matching the event date. It was irrefutable proof that he couldn't have been in Lagos to sign any will that day. Meanwhile, Sada's camp seemed oblivious to the brewing counterattack. They continued issuing statements and leaking gossip to the press, painting Adesua as a disgruntled widow who couldn't accept the reality of her late husband's legitimate child. Some tabloids ran sensational headlines, speculating about Tund's double life and the dramatic inheritance battle. Adesua tried to ignore the whispers and focus on the looming court date. The emotional toll, however, was immense. Tommy had grown quieter at home, burying herself in her studies to avoid the drama. Adesua felt pangs of guilt whenever she saw her daughter's anxious eyes, yet she drew strength from the girl's resilience. They would endure this together, come what may. Finally, the preliminary hearing arrived. The courthouse in Lagos was a sprawling concrete structure, bustling with lawyers, litigants, and spectators. Adesua's stomach churned as she walked up the steps, Kunnal at her side. They passed corridors packed with people waiting to have their cases heard. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the aroma of fried snacks from a hawker outside. Inside courtroom 5, the atmosphere was tense. Saad and her legal team sat on the opposite side, their faces inscrutable. Beo was not present. Apparently, Saad had opted not to involve him in the legal proceedings just yet. Adesua wondered what stories Saad had told the boy about his newfound fortune. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, presided over the bench. After calling the case, she gave both sides a chance to present their preliminary arguments. Sada's lawyer recapped the contents of the contested will, emphasizing its validity and the need to honor the late Chief Balagan's last wishes. Then came Kunnal's turn. In measured, crisp language, he presented the issue of Tund's whereabouts on the alleged signing date, along with flight itineraries and conference photos as evidence of the impossibility of Tund being in Lagos at that time. Sada's legal team looked visibly unsettled for the first time. The judge scrutinized the documents, her eyebrows arching with interest. "These are serious allegations," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "If proven, it suggests forgery, which is a criminal offense." Seeing an opening, Kunnal pressed further. "We're requesting a forensic analysis of Tund's signature. We also ask the court to grant an order preventing any party from selling, transferring, or altering the status of the properties until the authenticity of this will is fully investigated." The judge deliberated for a moment, then banged her gavel lightly. "Motion granted. The properties shall remain in the status quo until this court reviews the forensic evidence and hears witness testimonies. Next hearing is set for 6 weeks from today." Relief flooded Adesua's body. For at least 6 weeks, Saad could not legally evict her or sell off Tund's assets. She glanced over at Saad, who tried to maintain a neutral expression, but the flash of panic in her eyes was unmistakable. As they exited the courtroom, Saad approached Adesua with an icy stare. "So you found a loophole, huh? You think this changes anything?" she sneered, crossing her arms. "I have witnesses who will testify that Tons signed that will." Adesua inhaled slowly, trying not to let her anger flare in public. "If Tons' signature was real, you wouldn't be so nervous," she said quietly. "We both know you're playing a dangerous game." Saad shook her head, her braids swishing over her shoulders. "This isn't a game. It's about my son getting what belongs to him. But I'll warn you one last time, back off before you embarrass yourself and your daughter any further." Their eyes locked in a tense standoff before Kunnal stepped between them, guiding Adesua away. Outside the courthouse, a few onlookers gawked, and a reporter tried to snap photos. Kunnal shielded Adesua, telling the reporter, "No comment at this time, please respect our client's privacy." The short drive back home was a blur of emotions: exhaustion, relief, anger, and a sliver of hope that justice might be on the horizon. Adesua realized she was far from victorious. They had only won a temporary stay. The real battle would unfold in the coming weeks, with depositions, forensic tests, and cross-examinations. Yet for the first time, she felt the wind shift in her favor. The notion that the will was fraudulent was no longer just an allegation. It was a possibility the court was taking seriously. When she reached her home, the mansion she still claimed as her own, she found Tommy waiting on the front steps, wringing her hands nervously. Adesua hugged her daughter tightly. "We got some good news today," she said softly. "We have time, Tommy. We have time to prove the truth." Tommy closed her eyes, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I knew you'd find a way," she whispered, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Dad wouldn't want us to lose everything he worked for." As the sun dipped below the skyline, bathing the property in a warm, fading glow, Adesua felt a renewed sense of purpose. She might be fighting the most difficult battle of her life, but at least now, she wasn't fighting blind. The next 6 weeks leading up to the trial date were a crucible of stress and anticipation. Kunnal and his team spent countless hours preparing legal arguments, cross-referencing Tun's travel history, and arranging for experts to examine the question signatures. Adesua supplemented their efforts by digging into every possible source of corroborating evidence. She emailed the Cape Town conference organizers to request official attendance logs, even contacting some of Tun's associates who had traveled with him. Many responded sympathetically, providing photos and emails that placed Tund in South Africa at the critical date. Meanwhile, Sada's lawyers fought back with their own arsenal of strategies. They filed objections claiming that Tund could have digitally signed the will or that the notarization date might have been delayed. Anything to muddy the waters. At one point, they even produced 2 witnesses, Tund's longtime driver and a house help, who swore they had seen Tund sign the will in Lagos on the 26th. This blatant contradiction of physical evidence jolted Adesua, revealing just how far Saad was willing to go. Financially, Adesua was on edge. She had tapped nearly all her resources to keep the legal team afloat. She had sold off more jewelry and relied on Remy's small contributions whenever possible. Each day, she dreaded the possibility that Sada's side might bribe a court official or manipulate the system to get a hasty, favorable ruling. Corruption, unfortunately, was not unheard of in high-stakes cases. But Kunnal reassured her that the presiding judge was reputed to be one of the more incorruptible figures on the bench. That, at least, offered a glimmer of hope. As the final hearing day approached, the city buzzed with rumors. Some tabloids carried headlines like Battle of the Balligans, Secret Son vs. Widow, and Mystery Will Spark Society Scandal. A few sensational talk shows debated the moral complexities of a man who left his legitimate wife and daughter in the lurch. Strangers on the street recognized Adesua from her pictures, offering her pitying looks or hushed gossip as she passed by. She tried her best to ignore them, focusing on the steps ahead. When the trial finally commenced, courtroom 2 was packed. Even some of Tun's old business partners came to watch the spectacle. On the plaintiff's side sat Adesua, flanked by Kunnal and his paralegals. Remy and Tommy occupied seats behind them, offering silent support. On the defense side, Saad exuded confidence. She wore a sleek, tailored dress in royal blue, hairstyled in a towering updo. Beside her sat Barrister Abel, his expression unreadable, but his posture stiff with focus. The judge began by summarizing the dispute, whether the will presented by Saad was valid or whether it was a forgery designed to deprive Adesua and Tommy of their rightful inheritance. Connell presented the court with an array of documentation: flight tickets, immigration stamps, conference photographs, and statements from individuals confirming Tun's presence in Cape Town on September 26. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge scrutinized these exhibits. Next, the forensic handwriting expert took the stand. He displayed magnified images of Tun's signature from known documents compared to the disputed will. Using laser pointers and microscopic analysis, he demonstrated several inconsistencies in the pen pressure, slant, and spacing of the letters. In my professional opinion, the expert stated firmly, the signature on this will is not made by the same person who signed the reference documents. The differences are subtle, but they are consistent with forgery. A murmuring broke out among onlookers. Sada's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing. Barrister Abel stood to cross-examine the expert, grilling him on methodology, margin of error, and the possibility of Tun signing in unusual circumstances. The expert remained unfazed, reiterating that while forgeries can be sophisticated, the anomalies he identified strongly indicated that Tun had not penned the contested signature. Sada's two witnesses were called to the stand next. The driver repeated his claim that he had seen Tun sign some papers in the study that day. Adesua's stomach churned as she listened. She knew this man well. He had served the family for many years, and she suspected he was either threatened or bribed. Connell's cross-examination revealed discrepancies in the driver's timeline, and the man appeared nervous, often contradicting himself. By the end of his testimony, he had done more harm than good for Sada's case. The house help statement was similarly shaky. Connell produced payroll slips showing she was on leave that week, casting serious doubt on her credibility. The judge made detailed notes, her expression growing sterner as each contradiction came to light. Finally, Saad herself took the stand. She tried to maintain composure, painting a picture of a secret love story between her and Tund, and his profound remorse for not being fully present in Bayo's life. She insisted that Tund had confided in her his wish to protect Bayo above all else. He loved his daughter Tommy, Saad said, feigning sincerity, but he felt the need to compensate for the shame and neglect he had put my son through. Connell stood up for the cross-examination. You said Tund signed this will in your presence on September 26th? Saad nodded. Yes. We were at his Lagos home. And you claim there were no other witnesses, just you and Tund? She paused. Yes, it was private, to avoid scandal. Connell raised an eyebrow. But you presented two witnesses who just testified they were there. So which is it? Were they present or not? A ripple of laughter and gasps swept the courtroom. Sada's eyes flitted to her lawyer, and she stammered. But I must have misspoken. They came in shortly after Tun signed. Connell moved in for the kill. Isn't it true, Miss Shadapo, that you conspired with others to forge this will and used coercion to secure witness testimonies that would validate your claim? Saad glared, flipping from vulnerability to anger. That's a lie. I'm telling the truth about Tun's wishes. That's all I've ever done, she insisted, gripping the stand so hard her knuckles whitened. Then how do you explain Tun's documented presence in South Africa on the alleged day of signing? Connell pressed. We have official records from immigration, plus photographic evidence. Sada's mouth fell open, but she composed herself quickly. Perhaps the date on the will was incorrectly notarized. Or perhaps Tund flew back secretly for a day. He had a private jet sometimes, you know. That's plausible. Connell smirked. We also have flight records showing Tund arrived in Lagos on October 1st. No private flights recorded. Are you claiming there's an unregistered clandestine flight you know about? That's a serious accusation involving multiple agencies. With each question, Sada's story crumbled further. By the end of her cross-examination, the judge looked unimpressed, repeatedly reminding Saad of the penalties for perjury. Sada's earlier confidence had all but vanished. After several days of testimonies and arguments, the judge called both counsel for closing statements. Barrister Abel tried to salvage the situation, invoking the rights of an illegitimate child to their father's estate under Nigerian law. He argued that even if the will were void, Bayo deserved inheritance. While that was a valid legal point, it did not address the forgery at hand. Connell's closing speech was succinct but devastating. "Let us not ignore the glaring evidence, my lord. This will was contrived to look authentic but falls apart under scrutiny. Chief Tun's legitimate widow and daughter should not be punished for a forgery concocted under unscrupulous motives. We do not deny Bayo may be Tun's son, but the method by which Ms. Shadapo attempted to secure his future is undeniably fraudulent." The court adjourned for a verdict the following week. During that wait, Adesua vacillated between guarded optimism and paralyzing dread. She would stare at Tommy's sleeping form at night, tears slipping down her cheeks, praying for justice. Meanwhile, Sada's menacing messages had ceased entirely, a sign that she was likely feeling the heat. Rumors swirled that she was considering an out-of-court settlement. But Adesua refused to budge. The time for negotiations had passed. She wanted the truth to be laid bare before the law. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was again filled to capacity. Adesua felt her hands shake as the judge read her prepared statement. In clear, unwavering language, the judge declared the contested will fraudulent and void, citing the overwhelming evidence that Tund could not have signed it on the stated date. The older will Adesua had found was reaffirmed as the valid testament of Chief Tund Balagan. The judge also reprimanded Saad for her deceit, instructing that criminal investigations into possible forgery charges be initiated. Adesua felt her heart soar with relief, tears streaming down her face as Tommy embraced her from behind. Saad sank into her seat, face pale, while Barrister Abel looked on grimly. Reporters in the gallery snapped photos of the emotional scene. Yet the drama was not over. Moments later, uniformed officers approached Saad, handing her a summons that indicated she was under investigation for forgery. "Miss Shadapo," one officer said, "will need you to come with us to the station for further questioning." Saad looked around frantically but found no sympathy. Her grand scheme had collapsed, and the law was closing in. Outside, Adesua gave a short statement to the journalists gathered around. "I am relieved the truth has come to light," she said softly. "All I ever wanted was to protect my daughter's rightful legacy and honor my late husband's memory with dignity. Justice has prevailed today." In that moment, surrounded by a flurry of camera flashes and the swirl of onlookers, Adesua felt her chest tighten with gratitude and closure. She had walked through the darkest storm, carrying her daughter's future in her hands, and emerged victorious. Her tears were now tears of triumph, shining in the sunlight as she stepped forward into a new chapter of her life. Adesua looked out over the lush garden behind the Ikoyi mansion, soaking in the late afternoon sun. It had been a year since the court's verdict restored the property and other assets to her name and reaffirmed her daughter, Tommy, as the primary heir. The nightmare of Sada's forgery case now felt like a distant memory, though some scars lingered. When she closed her eyes at night, she sometimes recalled the furious stares and bitter confrontations. But each new day was a reminder that justice, while slow and costly, had indeed been served. In the immediate aftermath of the court ruling, Saad had been arrested on charges of forgery and conspiracy. Despite her frantic attempts to negotiate a lighter sentence or avoid trial, the evidence against her was compelling. There were too many contradictions, too many purchased witnesses who eventually recanted or admitted to being bribed. After a lengthy process, she eventually received a prison sentence, though she was eligible for parole after a few years. Meanwhile, the boy, Bayo, was placed under the guardianship of Sada's aunt. Adesua felt a twinge of sadness for the child. He was innocent of his mother's crimes. She prayed he would grow up more honorably than the path Saad had tried to carve for him. Back at home, life had taken on a gentler rhythm. Adesua's first priority was to stabilize Tommy's education. The girl was now preparing for university entrance exams, her eyes set on studying architecture, just like her father had planned to do in his youth before life steered him into business. Adesua smiled whenever she saw Tommy hunched over her drafting sketches, so focused and hopeful. Financially, Adesua was in the process of reorganizing Tun's estate. With Connell's guidance, She regained access to bank accounts, investments, and real estate holdings. It was a staggering responsibility, but she approached it cautiously, determined not to repeat any of Tun's mistakes. A portion of the funds was placed into a trust for Tommy's education and future endeavors. Another portion Adesua invested in philanthropic projects that Tund had once championed, funding scholarships, renovating local schools, and supporting small-scale entrepreneurs. She believed in continuing Tund's legacy, a way to honor the man she had loved, despite his flaws. In the months that followed, Adesua also sought a measure of personal healing. She had spent so many years in Tund's shadow, overshadowed by his larger-than-life persona. Now, for the first time, she discovered her own capabilities. She turned the once-neglected catering hobby into a proper business, launching Adesua's Kitchen, which specialized in gourmet African fusion cuisine. Her elegant dinner parties soon became the talk of high society, and ironically, some of the very same socialites who had distanced themselves during her court battles were now clamoring to book her services. She was polite to them but remained cautious, never forgetting how quickly loyalties could shift when adversity knocked. One afternoon, Remy dropped by, carrying a new contract for Adesua's catering business. "I just spoke to some organizers of a big cultural festival in Victoria Island," Remy said, excitement lighting up her face. "They want you to handle the entire menu. We're talking thousands of plates, a prime spotlight." Adesua grinned, flipping through the paperwork. "This is fantastic, Remy. Thank you for always standing by me." Remy waved a hand dismissively. "Family is family. That sod fiasco taught me we should never let petty dramas overshadow blood ties. We overcame, didn't we?" "Yes, we did." Adesua poured Remy a cup of ginger tea, reflecting on how Remy had been her unwavering pillar. She hoped to repay that loyalty in any way she could, be it through shared success or simply the warmth of gratitude. Later that evening, Adesua strolled around the mansion's corridors. In one room, Tommy was studying with a friend. Their laughter echoed down the hallway, a testament to the renewed peace in the household. She paused at Tun's old study. Though she had cleared out most of his papers, she left some of his favorite books on the shelves. Occasionally, she found herself flipping through them, reading his scribbled notes in the margins. It was a way to reconnect with the man she once saw as her protector and partner, even if he had, in the end, been too flawed to protect her from his own indiscretions. In truth, Adesua had long forgiven Tund for his affair. The court's revelations convinced her more than ever that the final will was not of his making. She no longer harbored bitterness toward his memory. Instead, she chose to remember him as the man who doted on Tommy, who worked tirelessly to build businesses, and who helped others rise from poverty. On occasion, thoughts of Sod bubbled up. Adesua felt a complicated mix of anger and pity. The woman had tried to seize fortune by deception, fueled perhaps by desperation or greed. Either way, her downfall was a cautionary tale about what happens when one tries to circumvent moral and legal boundaries. Adesua prayed that prison time would prompt Sod to reflect and change, though she doubted such a transformation would come easily. Not long after, Adesua's phone buzzed, a message from Kunnel. He wanted to confirm a date for the final formalities regarding Tund's estate transfer. She typed a quick reply, promising to visit his office next week. With the legal storms behind her, it was now time to shape the future on her own terms. A sense of liberation swept over her. She was no longer the trembling widow who cowered before bullies armed with fake wills. She had stood her ground, mustered her resources, and fought with every ounce of determination she could muster. And the universe, or God, or destiny, whatever one might call it, had rewarded her perseverance with a chance to reclaim her life. That night, after Tommy went to bed, Adesua took a final stroll through the house. She paused by a large portrait of Tund in the foyer, gently touching the frame. "We're okay," she whispered to the still image. "Your daughter is okay. Your legacy stands firm." She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it was not sadness. It was closure, an acceptance that life would continue, shaped by both the joys and sorrows of the past. She walked outside to the garden, the air filled with the chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. The moon glowed brightly above, illuminating the manicured lawns Tund had once admired. He was gone, and the scars from his extramarital entanglement had nearly destroyed them. Yet here they were, still standing, enriched by lessons in resilience and the power of truth. Inhaling deeply, Adesua gazed up at the sky, marveling at its expanse. She thought of the future, a world of possibilities for Tommy, her budding business, and the philanthropic endeavors that would keep Tund's memory alive in a more honest, honorable way. A smile curved her lips as she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for everyone who helped her along the way: Remy, Kemi, Kunnel, the investigators, and even the watchful eyes of the judicial system that ensured justice was served. Then, with a final look at the moon, she turned toward the house, stepping confidently into the next chapter of her life, one where she and her daughter could finally live in peace, the rightful keepers of all that Tund had left behind, and the authors of a brand new destiny that belonged solely to them. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.